I've shared a bit before with you all about my call to serve God in Nicaragua and how from there God called me back to the States and to seminary and to become a pastor. Well, when I first got sick in Nicaragua and the rheumatoid arthritis had inflamed so many of my joints, I was put on bed rest. My country director, Kim, was out of the country. I had shared with her, as had my colleagues, about how bad it was and how many people, both Nicaraguans and Americans, were advising me to return to the U.S. But Kim hadn't seen me or talked with me in person yet. And it wasn't that she doubted the severity of the disease. It was that simply having an illness doesn't necessarily mean you pack up your bags and leave. Many missionaries stay in the mission field with a variety of diseases. The difference for me was that through the arthritis, God was calling me to leave Nicaragua and to come home. The difference was God speaking this verse we read from Isaiah, "Look, I'm doing a new thing." Before approving my early departure, Kim asked me to meet with Joel, a fellow American missionary, although serving with a different mission agency. Joel had also developed a chronic disease, something similar to my arthritis, during his time in Nicaragua. And he had stayed on and worked through it and figured out how to treat it there. We shared our stories, and I had one question for Joel, which was to ask if at the onset of his disease, if God had told him God was about to do a new thing. And Joel said no. And that was the difference for me. I was supposed to be there for 3 years. I was there about 13 months. And I didn't end the time there early because folks advised me to, or because I could get better health care in the U.S. I left before my contract ended because God said he was about to do a new thing. And when I asked God, "Are you sure?" And I set out 3 fleece tests, just like Gideon did in the Old Testament book of Judges, God answered all 3 of them. God was indeed about to do a new thing. And I obeyed and went back to North Carolina. I tell my husband he was like the cherry on top, because it was after I returned, as I was applying to seminaries, that we started dating and then got married a year later. When God originally spoke this word through Isaiah, it was to a people being carried away into exile, carried away from their homes by a conquering army. Yet that situation in which Israel found itself is rather a timeless one, not because we can relate to the experience of exile, but because we've all experienced the grim shadow of past tragedies, the way in which those ghosts of past loss and shame and grief can swirl around us and can cloud our vision, preventing us from seeing anything but despair and darkness. We've all had sudden deaths or broken relationships or bad decisions or disease or some tragedy. And those things can linger about us and hinder our ability to move into the future. And what's more, they can cause us to doubt the promises we've received in Jesus Christ, the promises of forgiveness, the promises of new life, the promises of God's love. And so Isaiah reminds the people of all that God has already done for them. God's the one who made a way through the sea, a reference to the parting of the Red Sea when they escaped Egypt. God's the one who can make the way in the desert, in the wilderness, when he provided food, manna, and water for their survival while they wandered around for 40 years. God's the one who made us and will not forsake us. And yet then in Isaiah, as soon as we get this great image of a path through the mighty waters with the army never to rise again, God says, no, those are the former things. Don't dwell on what happened long ago or cling to the things of the past. It begs the question then, so what do we do with the past? We want to honor what's come before, and we can still do that faithfully. Because here's the thing about memory and remembering former things. Memory can be a strength. Knowing how we got here, remembering where we came from so we can honor our roots and our ancestors and the faith is a good thing. Remembering the past can help you survive. Knowing about past mistakes means you don't repeat them in the future and can lead to greater future successes. Memory can be our reference point for interpreting events and life circumstances. Memory tells us who we are and helps us respect our past and how we got here. However, unfortunately, memory can also be a hindrance. You've heard of folks who are stuck in the past. That happens when you continue holding on too tightly to the past. Or people who view the past through rose-colored glasses, where they remember only the good and you forget the bad. It's a really easy thing to do, isn't it? Clinging too tightly to a memory can cause you to misinterpret what's going on now. If someone from the 1950s were to show up here this morning, they'd be appalled by how many of us ladies are wearing pants, right? They'd be appalled by anyone wearing jeans or sneakers. And they'd be appalled by a female preacher. They'd recognize that we're in a church, but they might not be sure what else is going on. If you hold too tightly to former things, you won't be able to embrace new things. There's got to be room for something new to spring up, much less flourish. It's like when you come home from the grocery store and you want to carry all the groceries in at one time, right? You pick up all the bags. And then you get to your door. You've got to put down some of the bags in order to unlock and open your front door. Not necessarily all the bags, but at least one hand has to be free. God's not saying forget who you are and where you came from. God's not saying obliterate the past. God's saying don't cling to it. Don't dwell on it. Keep some memories with you and go on to the next thing. There's got to be room for the new. I had to actually leave Nicaragua to go to seminary. In my case, I had to physically move in order for there to be room for a new thing. Yet remember, what God has done for you before, God will do again. So hold on, trust in the Lord, and keep faith. What God has in store for you is as miraculous and satisfying as water in the wilderness. So instead of the image of crossing the Red Sea to escape Pharaoh's army, God says, see, I'm doing a new thing. Now it springs up. And to my mind, that gives an image of a new plant sprouting up from the earth, right? Now it springs up. Now, as I have learned the past 2 years, and as you all have known for a lot longer, farmlands are not wild. So my image of a plant springing up is of something organized, of civilization. You know, farming's an activity where you plant all your seeds in rows. They're at certain distances from each other. Animals are kept in fences. So a new plant sprouting up suggests something organized and civilized to me. And yet then God says, I'm making a way in the wilderness and streams in the wasteland. The wild animals will honor me. Wild animals are going to eat that new plant, right? This new plant, though, is sprouting up in the wilderness and the wasteland and has wild animals around it. And I don't know about you, it makes me wonder what happened to civilization and why not tame animals? Why is the new thing in the wilderness and with wild animals? Why is the new thing wild? Why in a wasteland? Does it mean we can see it better because there's higher contrast between it and its surroundings? Except a new plant is small, it can be hard to see. And if it's surrounded by wilderness, with so much going on, it can be hard to spot, kind of like where's Waldo? Or a new plant coming up in the garden among, if I haven't done all the weeding, so this comes up in the weeds, and so how do you know which is which? This new thing sprouting up in the wilderness of our lives, the wilderness of Lent. Jesus spent 40 days in the wilderness before beginning his ministry. Israel spent 40 years wandering the wilderness before reaching the promised land. It doesn't seem fair that to reach the promised land, you have to go through the wilderness. To get to Easter, you have to go through the cross. So this new thing sprouting up like a small plant. Maybe hard to see in the wilderness, and yet God's question is, do you not perceive it? The question suggests that we should be able to perceive it, that it should be obvious. Yet new things aren't always immediately obvious. They're not easily identifiable all the time. New things can start off small and hard to see. Yet it sounds like we're supposed to be able to perceive it. Jesus says many times, whoever has ears to hear, let them hear. It means we have to pay close attention to be able to catch a glimpse of the new thing God is doing. There's a saying that the 7 last words of a church are, we've never done it that way before. Have y'all heard this? A few nods. The last 7 words of a church. It's a sentiment that means we can't perceive the new thing God is doing now. And some churches won't try a new thing, and they end up closing their doors. Other churches choose to follow those 7 words with, but we can try it. And in doing so, they become something new, and God does a new thing in their midst. We know God has done this before. God did a new thing for Israel, bringing them out of exile. God did a new thing, sending Jesus into the world. God did a new thing on Good Friday, on the cross, and in the grave. Easter was a brand new thing. God has done this before, and we know God has acted in our midst before. God has acted here in this church before. God did a new thing planting this church here. God did a new thing in the ministries of this church over the, off the top of my head, 140 years, 130 years we've been here. God did a new thing when this church grew enough to support their own pastor. God has done all this before. We've seen God do new things before. We've seen God make a way where there seems to be no way. And we have faith God will do it again. God is the one who can lead us into a bright future that we can't always see, and we certainly can't create ourselves. It's like the refrain from the hymn of promise we're going to sing at the end of the service. It's something unrevealed until its season, something God alone can see. One of my favorite ways to reflect on life is by thinking about it in terms of what liturgical season you're in. If you're in a time of waiting, you're probably in Advent, right? That season of preparing and waiting for Christmas. Nothing special is going on, you're probably in ordinary time. The season that goes from Pentecost Sunday in June all the way till Advent. It's most of the year. This church has been in Lent, a time of pruning, a more solemn time, that season of waiting and preparing for Easter. Easter is a new thing, and yet the seeds for it are sown during Lent. We get ready for the celebration. We bring in the candy for the Easter egg hunt. We have a prayer vigil on Good Friday and Holy Saturday, keeping watch for the new thing that's coming on Easter. God's doing a new thing here at Lisbon. I think some of y'all can perceive that. I can perceive that. Seeds have been sown, small shoots are coming up. But here's where I'm still not quite there yet, which is that I can't quite describe the new thing. I couldn't quite define it or narrow it down. I know God's doing a new thing, but I couldn't quite tell you all the markers of it, and I don't think I'm catching all of them. Yet I know God's doing a new thing here in this place, just as God has before. And our prayer is the same one with the kids. Dear Jesus, give us the eyes to see the new things you are doing, whether they're big or whether they're small. Give us the eyes to see and the ears to hear. Amen.